Today, like I said, my focus is going to be on ancient China. I'm going to talk about the so-called Yellow River Valley civilization that begins in part of East Asia. So we'll get into the background of that. I'll kind of get into some of the early dynasties that rule over China in ancient times. I'll also talk about Chinese philosophy that gets started at the same time, like especially Confucianism, which is the most famous, started in China, is still around in parts of Asia today. So anyway, of course, we're going to be getting, like I said, into ancient China, at least in part one lecture for today. Of course, I'm going to talk about, China's early background. China, if you look at this particular picture, you can see with the Great Wall kind of snaking its way, through the valleys of, northern China there. You can see ancient China is pretty old. It's at least 7,000 years old, at least as a, agricultural type civilization that dates back. I think I mentioned this before, but China is the third oldest of the River Valley civilizations. Of course, based in the Yellow River Valley where it got started. I know they have the Yangtze and other, rivers that are in China as well today, but that's the one that they think China started around. So they call it the Wang or Wang Ho as well today. And of course, most of China, started in the eastern part of what is now today the People's Republic of China, as they call it now. If you go to this map here, got different maps, I think, of China, but this is the main one I've got right here, showing kind of like the modern map area of China. China mostly started in this area that's kind of south of Beijing. Beijing, is the capital of China today. But mostly started about right here, where it says Wang Ho or Yellow River, right here. In that area is considered to be area that they call now today the so-called North China Plain. It's kind of an alluvial plain area that was kind of created by a lot of the sediment, I guess, that was kind of washed up from the river basin of the Yellow River. It's kind of between the Yellow and the Yangtze, but kind of more north of the Yangtze. That's where it is. That's where basically a lot of their agriculture got started about close to 4,000 BC or so. Started growing different crops there in that region. It's also where a lot of the early states kind of started. Like a lot of the early capitals of China are kind of based close to about the Yellow River Valley from a long time ago. The Yellow River, by the way, is the second longest river in the world. It's almost 3,400 miles in length. Considered, well, I guess it is kind of considered one of the mother rivers of China. The Yangtze is a little longer. In fact, the Yangtze is the longest river in Asia. I forget how long the Yangtze, it might be 3,600 miles or more, I think, in length. So, yeah, the Yellow River is really deemed very important. I think dating back to, going back to, I want to say Paleolithic times, the first early humans, they think lived like in and around where the Yellow River Valley was. So I think I told you that's where they found the Peking man, those early human fossils of, Stone Age, men living in that part of Asia in ancient times. You can see from the geography, China's geography is heavily isolated. They're isolated by different things like geographic features, such as a lot of mountain ranges in the west that kind of isolate it. A lot of deserts in the north and the west as well. A lot of oceans and seas, of course, obviously to the east that help isolate it as a unique culture from other cultures that are outside of that, like, I guess, India or whatever. To the west. You can see some major deserts that they got here in this map that are famous. Of course, the Gobi Desert, which is between, Mongolia and China, is very famous and vast. That Gobi, I think, and Sahara deserts are some of the largest deserts in the world that are there. Taklamakan Desert is also over here, which is more into the western part of China. That's right there. A lot of different mountains, Kunlun Mountains, the Tibetan Mountains, kind of like up in here, Kilian Mountains over here as well. You also got like the Yellow Sea right here, East China Sea, Sea of Japan's kind of over here between China, Korea, and Japan. All that kind of helps to isolate China from other cultures that kind of make it unique overall. Of course, talk a little bit more about the Yellow River. The river is kind of known for its name. Yellow being used in, I don't know if you know much about it, but the yellowish brownish color is unique due to a type of soil or sediment that's in it. I think it's usually pronounced less, Loess. The O is silent usually, less. It's a type of clay sediment that's in the water, which has a lot of calcium carbonate in it. And so it kind of gives it kind of a yellowish brown color to it. I think sometimes in the part of the Mississippi River here, like in the southern United States, you kind of see that too, especially like around maybe Vicksburg, Mississippi. They have a lot of those kind of clay sediments that kind of fall into the water. And so that's basically where the color, gets its name over time, where they call it Yellow River, basically. So it's kind of important, that sediment. I think it helps to kind of help them grow crops and things like that. Ancient and up to modern China, etc. You'll notice on the right there that they have a nickname for the Yellow River, like in modern times. I think by the 19th, 20th century, they started calling it China's Sorrow. That's due to the fact that they had all these massive floods in their history that have killed a lot of people, like drowned people along the river. The two worst floods were in 1887 and 1931. The 1887 Great Flood killed somewhere between 1 and 2 million people when the river flooded. And in 1931, they had one, was really considered one of the greatest floods in history. Killed somewhere between 2 and 4 million people. They're not exactly sure how many it was. It's kind of an estimate. That was considered one of the worst natural catastrophes in history. They killed the most people. The 1931 flood in China. So I think since then they've dammed the river, like the Yellow River. It dams on these, like the Yellow Yangtze rivers that they have now. They built, like the Three Gorges Dam, I think is very famous. They built as an example of some dams in China. And so they've done that to try to control, I guess, Mother Nature more than anything. Speaking of like farming in general, the types of crops they grew, it varies, but I know in ancient times the big crops were millet and rice. Those are examples of different crops that they've grown going back to, say, Neolithic times. So they think farming started close to 4000 BC, usually a little earlier, before the Egyptians started farming. So they, I think, usually kind of count them before them. And then you can see other crops. Of course, they have grow all kinds of crops in China now today that they've got. But I've got some examples of some crops that are big. China, cotton, of course, they grow a lot of that. I know potatoes, soybean, tea, wheat. Those are all, I guess, examples of different kinds of crops that are grown pretty much in China overall. So anyway, just kind of talking about some of these examples of some of their background, geographically that they have. One other thing too, I also mentioned about the Chinese, which is well known. They are known for a lot of different new kinds of technologies that's affected the world overall. I think you can see the four greatest one you see in the middle: gunpowder, compass, paper, printing. I think those are probably the biggest things that they've done to kind of influence a lot of people. But obviously ink is something I think they were kind of known for. Gunpowder, everybody's heard of gunpowder. I think that might be one of the most famous ones they invented. That's well known because it was later used in like different kinds of firearms, cannon, etc. Of course, fireworks, of course, thing we know about in the United States now. Every time we have a 4th of July celebration, New Year's, we're popping off Chinese fireworks, basically. Crossbow, of course, they invented the crossbow, not in medieval Europe like some people think, originating in Asia, China. Silk, of course, which the Chinese were very secretive about for years. They do think the iron plow was likely invented by the Chinese. Porcelain, of course, another thing that, of course, the Chinese had as well. So there's a lot of different things that the Chinese have invented, over the years. So it's kind of going through a few of those things. I think it listed some other things, didn't it? Kind of, you can see there wheelbarrow, another thing, water wheel, sundial. Those are things they're kind of known for kind of inventing at one point as well. Um, I think I left out the compass. Yeah, that's another big invention. The compass, of course, you see that list in the middle, of course. So they've had all kinds of things that they've invented that's kind of well known. Now I'm going to get into and talk about also today, like China's like dynasties, which China's known for having a lot of dynasties over several thousand years. In fact, China's dynasties date, I think, is close to 3,600 years, which I think a little bit more than the actual Egyptian dynasties, which were, I think, close to about 30 for them. And the Chinese believe in this kind of political theory called mandate of heaven, you may have heard of, which in Chinese, it's actually Tian Ming, which means in Chinese, heaven's will. And what they mean by that is that the fact that the Chinese believe that the god or gods in heaven dictated who would rule dynasties. And so if a ruler's unjust, God will decide to choose a type of ruler, that will be just and right, and he'll be replaced with those that are not worthy of ruling. And so it's kind of similar to like maybe like the divine right of kings theory, which is kind of in Europe. This has more to do with like who should reign, like if they're not a good ruler, more than anything. The Chinese actually call a lot of their dynasties Tian Chao, which means celestial or heavenly dynasty. It's kind of a nickname they sometimes called their actual dynasties. And a lot of their emperors are called Shang, which means supreme god or supreme ruler or something like that. It's kind of what it means, basically. Anyway, I'll kind of go through some of the early dynasties today. I'll kind of mostly talk about the Shang dynasty. We'll also talk about the Zhou dynasty as well, that also ruled China. Later, we'll get to the more imperial type dynasties, like the Qin, the Han, and I'll even talk about the Tang dynasty a little later as well. So yeah, let me go ahead and first talk about the so-called Shang dynasty, which came in, I think, maybe close to about the 16th century or so. The Shang dynasty was the first major dynasty of ancient China. It's believed to have been a type of dynasty that was based in the eastern part of the Yellow River Valley, like the Wangho. And it was based around a capital that was called in ancient times, it was called Yin, spelled Y-I-N there, Yin, I think is how they said it. And today it's now a major city, which is there in ancient China, eastern China, which is Anyang, which has a population of about, maybe you can see about 5 million people that live there today. So Anyang is the modern name for actually the same city itself that's there now. So it's kind of debate about when it was, but they think, it started like somewhere in northern China, about northeastern China. Of course, one of the things that they're known for, which we'll talk about today, is the fact that the Shang are kind of credited with, starting a lot of their writing language systems in ancient China, which, Chinese calligraphy or Chinese language or writing was something that they think is one of the oldest language systems in the world, at least in Asia. The Shang were famous for developing Old Chinese from written records that were part of what they call oracle bones that were left behind by their people. And oracle bones were like these bones or shells that were used by a lot of the Shang to use for like prophecy or what they call divination, which means to basically try to tell the future, like what's going to happen, I guess, in China. And so they would write basically early Chinese calligraphy on turtle shells or I think ox bones and things like that. And then what they would do with it, I think they would take these bones, which I think I've got some pictures of them right here of some of these types of bones, and they would put them on like over a fire or some kind of heat. The cracks in it would enable people to see the future of what's going to happen. I think they'd ask like questions on it, like, will the ruler have a son? And things like that. Will the weather be good? Will we have a lot of crops? And things like that. And so that's primarily what they used for it, was basically divination. Richard, by the way, is joining us, having a great afternoon overall. So yeah, that's kind of how language got started over time. And so that was something that the Shang were kind of, primarily known for. The Shang did have some forms of religion as well. They did believe in like a supreme god, which I think was called Shang Di or Shang Ti, what they called it, which, by the way, that also was later on what they called the emperors. The emperors are often called that too. Shang Di or Shang Ti, basically, I thought I meant supreme ruler or supreme god or something like that. It's kind of the translation of what it meant. And they were primarily ruled by absolutist type monarchs, had total power over the people. I think a lot of the early rulers of China were very despotic in origin. I think that's part of why they came up with the whole mandate of heaven later, which was something the Zhou dynasty kind of came up with. And a lot of the monarchs were involved in a lot of these divination ceremonies involving, like I told you, the oracle bones and all of that. But the Shang were they were known for different things. Like besides being, one of the first Bronze Age cultures to kind of come about in China, they were known for introducing a lot of new things. Like the war chariot was kind of introduced into warfare in China. They developed some of the first ceramic pottery, also as being used in China. They also did a lot of metalwork, and also jade. Jade's a big thing they use, the type of stone used to make different things, jewelry, pottery, and other things with it. Of course, in ancient China at the time, like these Shang pottery you're looking at right here as an example. So they were around a long time. The actual Shang dynasty, they reigned close to several hundred years that they were actually in power before they fell to another dynasty that came in called the Zhou. So a lot of the early dynasties, like the Shang and like the Zhou, are pretty much first ruled by kings, and then later they'll have emperors that come in a little later. So that's the next thing I need to get into is talk about some of the other dynasties that came in, which is the so-called, they got different slides on the Zhou dynasty that comes in right here. Yeah, you've got the Zhou state that shows up next, that takes over as a dynasty. Like I said, that's the second major dynasty and state that controls China. It's kind of a debate about how you say it. I think it's actually pronounced Zhou, like a J sound, not a Ch, like Joe. So they actually say it Joe. But anyway, they're actually the longest reigning dynasty in Chinese history. Reigning, you can see they're close to about the 12th dynasty or so, going down to like the third dynasty, third century BC. So close to 800 years or so that they're in power overall. It's believed that the Zhou, this particular dynasty, took over China, mostly in eastern China, and absorbed a lot of the culture of the Shang state, whether it be culture or whatever, and of course the Chinese language that they're starting to develop at that point. And the Zhou kind of go through different periods. I'll get into later, but they usually divide the Zhou state into two major periods. You've got the Western Zhou, which goes from about the 11th to about the 8th centuries. That's in BC times, which is like a Bronze Age or late Bronze Age state. And then you've got the Eastern Zhou, which is more like an early Iron Age state that they have. You can see that one on the second one there is more longer compared to the other ones, one before that they have. They are famous for introducing a lot of things to China that's famous. They think the crossbow, I think by that time, is starting to be developed at that time. Iron technology is also introduced. So they think that under the Zhou dynasty, the Iron Age begins in China. So you might have things like iron chariots, iron plow, and other things kind of coming about later because of that kind of new technology being added. They think they developed the first coin. They coined money. It used to be for money back then. The mandate of heaven, the Zhou were the ones that invented that political theory to decide, why rulers rule. And they said that basically the Shang got overthrown because their kings were unjust. So that's why we're the dynasty now in charge, because we're keeping up with the mandate in heaven. So that's kind of how other emperors later, or kings, rule later in China, based off of that theory. By the way, the Zhou formed a new capital, which is called Luoyang, I think was the ancient name they called it. Now it's called Zhangqiao, I think is the actual how they say it today, the name of the city. It's in Henan province in the People's Republic of China. It's got a city population of about 10 million to it. So that's one of several ancient cities of China, famous cities of China that have been capitals at one point. Actually, there's 4 historical capitals that China has had at one point. Believe it or not, of course, the one we know today is Beijing, or also known as Peking. Is the current modern capital, which has been the capital for a long time, going back to, I want to say, late Middle Ages. That's been Nanjing, or also called Nanking, has also been another capital at one point. I'll tell you about Zhangqiao or Luoyang, of course. Later, I'll talk about Xi'an, which for a long time was also called Chang'an. That's also been another capital of China for a long time as well. So yeah, that's one of the many capitals that China's kind of gone through over the time for many, many years, over, I guess, a couple thousand years or whatever. Now, one more thing I need to talk about this particular dynasty. It's kind of famous. There is a period in their history where they kind of go through a feudal period within the Zhou dynasty, that kind of the actual state in China. And it's often called Fangjin, I think is the common term they use for it. So-called Chinese feudal system, which dominated China for several hundred years, where China's whole economy, its social strata, whatever, was controlled by a system of lords, vassals. And on the bottom, you had all these peasants that were kind of like maybe almost like serfs that were under them. And it has been often compared with medieval Europe. It went through kind of a feudal period, between the ancient and modern times that they had, and included like a hierarchy where the kings or lords were at the top, and they had nobility that were under them, and then you had commoners, that were people that were non-nobility, that were part of the whole, I guess, feudal system they had, and they even broke up the common people into different occupations. They kind of do this in Europe later as well, if you know about this. And so they had merchants, people that were gentry, people that were peasants, and people that are just laborers. They're just like, I guess, we call non-skilled type labor, basically. And so that's how they broke society down throughout China. And there was even a case where they would share the land, which is kind of like what happened in medieval Europe, where they, the peasants shared land with the nobility or the lords, basically. And the Chinese had something similar to that called the well-field system, where they would basically divide the land into 9 sections. Looked like a tic-tac-toe, like if you draw a tic-tac-toe, and basically the middle part that was in the middle, there you put an X there or whatever, that would be the public field for the lord. where the peasants would all have to work that land for the Lord. They'd give the crops to him, like sharecropping, whatever. And all the eight, parts that are around the tic-tac-toe thing on the edges of it or whatever, all the other eight fields would be the peasants, where the peasants could work that land for themselves. So it's kind of interesting about that. It's kind of similar to medieval Europe back then. It has been often compared with that sometimes. The only thing about the Chinese feudal period under this particular Zhou state is that China began to decline because the Zhou state began to break up these rival feudal states ruled by kings, or I guess ruled by various lords that became powerful throughout China. And so it led to this period known as the period of the warring states, where what happened in China was that China broke up into competing states that fought for control. You can see here in this particular map here. And you can see all these different states that start to kind of emerge there to control eastern part of China at the time. And so it lasts for quite a while. I forget exactly how many years it was. I'll get to it more into later, but it lasts about 2.5 centuries that they're fighting for control of that part of China at the time. And over time, what's going to happen is you see there's one state that's kind of in kind of a pinkish color, I guess right here, called Qin or Chen, really Chen, as they say it actually, Chen. Chen's going to take over, and it's going to conquer all the other states and form China into an empire. But at the time, you've got all these multiple states fighting for control of China at the time. You can even see how some are starting to build fortifications on some of their borders. That's part of how the Great Wall of China got built later. We read about it. So we'll get into that later. I'll kind of talk more about the Qin state. It takes over the rest of China. Now, I did want to talk about a period in Chinese history that's kind of important, that's well known. There's a period called the Spring and Autumn period in ancient China, which is kind of between the 8th and the 5th centuries BC. And what happened was during that time, there's a period where Chinese philosophy starts to kind of flourish throughout China. And you have the so-called, they call it the nickname, they call it the 100 schools of thought, starts to kind of come about, where you got all these competing different Chinese philosophies throughout China that are well known. I guess there were 100 of them at one point, why they call it that. But it becomes part of the golden age of Chinese philosophy, Chinese culture that flourishes afterwards. These are the big schools that came about that were kind of famous. Confucianism, of course, the most famous. Taoism, of course. Legalism became popular for a while. School of Yin and Yang, which kind of was part of Taoism as well. Those were ideas that kind of were born at that point in ancient China over, I guess, 2,500 years ago or so. The most famous they talk about is Confucius, and what we call, of course, Confucianism, as you know. And Confucius was a type of Chinese philosophical system. It's not really a religion. It's more like a philosophical system, which was based on the ideas of having morals and ethics within society as a whole, to create more harmony within the society, government, and also the family hierarchy, things like that. And they believe that Confucius lived about 2,600 years ago. It's about the time period of when he lived. He was this philosopher and also like a politician. And Confucius believed that China needed reforms, that it was too corrupt. They thought that the type of political system they had was unjust. And as you know, it's not his real name. You can see he went by the name Kung Fu Si, or usually Master Kong or Master Kung is usually what they call him in Chinese. And what happened was the Jesuits who came from Europe who I guess came to China in the 16th century, started calling him Confucius, taking the name Confuci, and it kind of got slurred together as that particular name. So it's more of a westernized name of what it became. I think that's now what they call it now, I guess. They use the same thing in, Asia now because of it. But that's basically how the name came about, over time. There's different things that Confucius taught as part of this philosophical system. Of course, one of the most famous is the so-called 5 basic relationships, which actually the nickname it's often called is the so-called 5 bonds. And it's a type of idea where they believe that there's got to be, these 5 principal relationships that could better society, make society better. And they believe that people ought to act a certain way, between each other, depending on how they're related with each other in general. And so here's examples of the 5 I've got up there. You see ruler and subject is usually one of the first that they have. Father and son, elder brother and younger brother, husband and wife, and then friend and friend. So the belief is that there should be some kind of regulated proper conduct that should exist between each of these bonds that are there. I guess they believe that's kind of something that will help to kind of make society better. So obviously the subject should be subservient to the ruler. The ruler should treat the subject a certain way. Father should be, of course, treat his son a certain way. And the son obviously should be subservient to the father. That's how it usually is. The younger brother or younger sibling, usually subservient to the older sibling and things like that. Wife subservient to the husband, things like that. These are kind of things that you still see pretty much in parts of Asia today. So-called 5 basic relationships. It's still kind of around. Also, there's other things that Confucius also taught too. Of course, they're big on education, as you know, like focus on education. Traditional family values are very important as well. They believe heavily in filial piety, respect towards elders, respect towards your ancestors, like deceased ancestors, parents, grandparents, things like this. These are, all key virtues you see a lot in a lot of Asian countries in the East as a whole. We see it in other religions too, like Buddhism, etc. Probably in Hinduism also as well in the East. Also similar to that is ancestor veneration or the veneration of the deceased or dead. That's something they also do as well under Confucianism. Respect, toward the dead, things like that. Even the Chinese kind of see your dead ancestors as almost like deified gods, living in heaven and things like that. Because of Confucius, Confucius wanted basically the government to employ people based off of merit. That's one thing that Confucianism kind of favored, rather than based off of maybe your lineage, like if you're wealthy or nobility, that kind of thing. Confucius believed that it ought to be based off of, how well you do as a person, like say through merit and through testing. That's one thing I think that Confucius kind of wanted to actually enact that they didn't want to do in China, which is some kind of like civil service type testing that they do now today. That was something that he kind of favored more than anything. A lot of his philosophical teachings were later called different names. They're called all kinds of names. I know the Confucian Analects or Analects of Confucius has been a common nickname that they often call the teachings or sayings of Confucius that were kind of compiled over time, over, I guess, a few hundred years that it was. He is known for different teachings that's very famous. The one you've probably heard about, that's the most famous, is the Golden Rule. It's, of course, been used pretty much elsewhere throughout the world, even in the West. Like Jesus, I think in the New Testament, kind of used the Golden Rule. But it's this idea or principle that you should treat others how you want to be treated. So I think the common saying by Confucius is, "Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself." Basically, you want to treat people how you want to be treated, and so that's a common teaching that you see later, even in the West. I think you even see it in the Hammurabi Code, believe it or not, in Mesopotamia. It's in the Bible also as well. I think in ancient Greece, there was kind of some ideas behind that too, as well. Greek culture. I don't have a map, but Confucianism did spread to other areas of the world. It went into, obviously, mostly into Asia, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan. Those are all areas where Confucianism is kind of still practiced today throughout the world. There's a little bit over 6 million. I forget exactly, but the number exactly, but it's a little over 6 million people practice it worldwide. I guess throughout the rest of the world, we have some minor people that also follow it, but it's more of a way of life, moralistic type, philosophical system than say like a religion. Some people kind of view it as that, but it's more of that than the other. Also, another dominant type of new philosophical system that was big in China was also Taoism, also called Taoism as well. It was founded around the same time, around maybe 2,500 years ago or so, by this Chinese philosopher named Lao Tzu, who was very famous for writing a book about his philosophy called Tao Te Ching, which means in Chinese, the way of virtue. In fact, it means the way. Taoism, Tao means the path or the way. And it's a type of rival philosophical system. I guess it was kind of a rival system to Confucianism, where they believe that your life should be lived in a way of harmony that's the way with the universe. And a lot of it has to do with the Taoist belief in that whole philosophy they talked about earlier about yin and yang, the yin and yang philosophy they had, that there was some kind of cosmic dualism that existed throughout the natural world, and that all these were kind of part of like balancing forces that kept the universe the way it is and from coming out of control, etc. And so they believed that there were all these opposites of each other that existed throughout the world in the universe, positive versus negative things. You got the sun, right? You got the moon. You've got female versus male. You got hot versus cold. You got heaven and earth, right? Kind of opposite each other. Light and dark. So all these different things that are opposite of each other that are kind of influential, etc. And you often see it with a symbol, that black and white symbol, of course, you see, which is an example of the dualism between the opposites of each other. So yeah, Taoism is kind of still around today. I don't think it's as popular as Confucianism, though, compared to that one as well. Also, I want to mention another philosopher. Really, he's not really a philosopher, more like a military strategist that was also big in ancient China as well. Lived about the same time, close to about 2,500 years ago. That's Sun Tzu, who is a very famous Chinese general in their history, was a well-known military strategist that was famous for his book, The Art of War, which I think a lot of people have read, I think, over the years. It's a very highly influential work, work that's well known. And a lot of it relates to military strategy, tactics on the battlefield, and they think he had a heavy influence on modern military tactics and history. So a lot of different, students of military history and studying battles and things like that have been influenced by Sun Tzu. I think there's even a case where I know in the business world they've kind of borrowed it and started to use it for business uses as well, and strategy with the, I guess, economics, etc., as well. It's a very famous quote. He said, "Every battle is won before it is fought." So yeah, I guess because of whatever strategy the generals come up with, a lot of times, the battle's been already decided before it's even been fought, more or less. So anyway, now later I am going to be moving on. I'm probably not today because we'll have a part 2 lecture coming up, but I am going to be moving on to talk about the rise of the Qin or Qin dynasty that we have later. That's going to be, of course, one of the first imperial dynasties that'll take over ancient China sometime at the end of the 3rd century BC. And China is going to form into an imperial state ruled by these autocratic emperors that they have. And so 3rd century up to I guess 1912, I think, when the last emperor of China, stepped down, China's going to have emperors for over 2,000 years that they'll have. So I'll talk about that dynasty. I'll talk about the Han dynasty that follows that afterwards. The Han dynasty is one of the longest reigning imperial dynasties they have in China. We'll also talk about the Tang dynasty as well. So it's kind of coming up later in the week on Wednesday for my part 2 lecture on ancient China. If you have any questions, comments, of course, about this particular lecture, let me know later, of course, through my channel. I don't look like I have any questions today. Looks like it overall. But before I go today, don't forget, I do have some assignments that are out there that you need to, of course, work on. Of course, the big thing we have is the first exam, of course, coming up. That's pretty much been posted the other day. That's going to be due sometime, I guess, this week, kind of coming up. I think you've got so many days to work on that and get it done. That's the one, of course, on ancient Egypt. And I did add that Phoenicians and Israelites lecture as well to that. So that's going to be on that. And then you've got the first vocab assignment due Wednesday this week. So that needs to be done. And because you got to start working on the second vocab assignment I've got posted already. That's on Canvas right now. If you haven't done the Mesopotamia quiz on those lectures, I still got it open. So try to get that done. Because remember, we had that Hurricane Ida that we had. And so I need to wrap that up because you're going to get behind if you don't, of course, with this particular class. So that's it for today, lecture-wise. Like I said, on Wednesday, I'll kind of continue and get into imperial China, and talk about some of the early dynasties that reign over China. I'll kind of briefly talk about some of the later dynasties that they have later that are kind of well known in ancient China. Now, I'll concentrate a lot on the Great Wall, which you see behind me. I'll talk a lot about that. I'll probably do a short little video on that too as well to add in. But we'll definitely talk about the Great Wall of China and why it was built, of course, and all that. So that's it for today. Y'all have a great, of course, rest of the week, and I'll see you later, of course, in the week. So y'all, of course, take care.